Today we're going to be talking about point of view in our writing. And before we can really play with writing with different points of view, we need to be able to identify the different points of view. We're going to talk about two major points of view today. We call these first person and third person point of view. So let's look. So, what is the point of view of a story? Well, the point of view is the perspective or the voice from which the story is told. So if I tell you a story about my weekend, I'm telling the story from my point of view. You're seeing it through my eyes, the way I experienced it. Different people can experience the same thing in different ways, and will have very different perspectives or point of views on things. For instance, this is classic. These two gentlemen are arguing about the number that's lying on the ground. This guy says it's a 6, and this guy says it's a 9. Are either of them wrong? Look at their perspective. Look at what they each see. They're only arguing what they see. You can only tell a story from your point of view, right? Well, here we go. There are three main points of view: first person, second person, and third person. They're real tricky to remember those names. The narrator is the person who's telling the story. Sometimes the narrator is a character in the story, but it doesn't have to be. Think about listening to Holes. We spent most of our time with Stanley and Stanley's family, but Stanley never said I think or I feel. We always heard what Stanley said or Stanley felt. So Stanley wasn't really telling the story, but we were kind of getting it from his point of view. The point of view can affect many other aspects of the story's plot and how appealing the story is to the reader. If the person telling the story is not a likable character, then sometimes that makes you not like the story. Sometimes we can be with a completely lovable character and it be a horrible story, but because we love the character, we love the story. Point of view is important, and the voice of the narrator is super important. So, how can we tell which point of view is being used? That's what we need to learn to do. We're going to ask these questions about the things that we read. First, we're going to look at the pronouns. Remember, pronouns are um, words that take the place of nouns. So instead of saying, Bob went to the store, Bob bought a Coke, Bob bought a candy bar, Bob went out to the car, I can replace Bob with he. He is the pronoun that takes the place of Bob. Okay, so the pronouns in writing are super important. They help us understand which point of view is being used. When you're looking at pronouns, you have to make sure that you're looking at the telling of the story and not the dialogue. Remember, the dialogue is what the characters say back and forth to each other, and you can tell what's dialogue because it's in the quote, in between the quotation marks. So you don't look for pronouns there. You look for pronouns outside of the dialogue in the telling of the story itself. So the second question you need to ask is the person telling the story an actual character in the story? Is the narrator a character in the story? And another question is, so what does that narrator know? What does the narrator share with us? Sometimes the narrator knows just about one character. Sometimes the narrator knows what everybody's thinking and feeling. Those are different kinds of point of view or perspectives. If we think about Holes again, um, even though our narrator wasn't Stanley, we knew what Stanley was thinking. We knew what Stanley was worried about. We knew how Stanley felt about the way his cot smelled, or what he thought about a guy being called barf bag, or about how hot or how tired he was. But the person telling the story wasn't Stanley. Now, in the book we're currently reading, in The Watsons Go to Birmingham, the person telling the story is a character, and is Kenny is telling the story. So it's those are very different kind of narrating experiences, and I'm glad we're doing both of those because it's going to be important to be able to tell the difference. So let's look at first person point of view. We're only going to look at first and third today. We're going to look at second in our next lesson. Let's talk about first person point of view. In first person point of view, the narrator is telling the story and they're using words like I and me and we. The narrator's telling the story, they're part of the story. You're seeing it through their eyes. You know what they're thinking. You're telling the story yourself. When I tell you a story about my weekend, I'm telling it in first person point of view. I'm the person who had the weekend. I'm the one who's telling you about the weekend. So the narrator is a character in the story. The narrator can express his or her own feelings, but the narrator, because the narrator is one character in the story, that narrator can't tell you what the other characters are thinking and feeling any more than you can tell a story and tell me what the person sitting next to you is thinking or feeling. We don't have the ability to read other people's minds and feelings that way. Stories from first person point of view can sometimes sound like a journal entry because they're telling you about something personal that's happened to them. That doesn't mean it has to be some big, deep, dark secret. It just means it's an experience that they had that they're telling you about. This point of view is commonly preferred because why? Most of the time it's preferred because you're getting the facts from the person who lived it. So that's a good way to get a story told. But I will say it's not the most common point of view or perspective that is used. First person point of view can often be nonfiction. It's telling you an actual story that happened. In the literature that we read, we don't get a lot of first person point of view because mostly what we're reading is fiction. So it's a made up story anyway. So nobody's actually had that experience. The point of view is not always reliable. Let's think about our guys on the front page that were looking at the numbers, 6 or 9. Neither one of them were wrong. Neither one of them were right. The story, we couldn't believe that it was definitely a 6, or we couldn't believe it was definitely a 9 because their points of view made it so different that it wasn't reliable. We weren't seeing truth. We were seeing their truth. And that's a little bit different. Here's an example of a first person narration. This is from Percy Jackson. My name is Percy Jackson. I'm 12 years old. Until a few months ago, I was a boarding student at Yancey Academy, a private school for troubled kids in upstate New York. Am I a troubled kid? Yeah, you could say that. So look at those pronouns. My, I'm, I, am I a troubled kid? So Percy himself is telling the story. We're going to skip right over second person point of view. We're going to come back to that later. I want to look at third person point of view. In third person point of view, the narrator uses pronouns such as he, she, it, they, and them. Often, you're not going to hear I. When you read the words I, me, my, that's an automatic. It's first person, so it's not going to be third person. Okay. So let me not get ahead of myself. In third person point of view, the narrator is not a character in the story. It's someone from outside the story telling the story. Like in Holes, we don't know who our narrator was. It wasn't an actual person in the story. It was someone from outside the story. It's the point of view that's the most common. In reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we were with Lucy most often, but Lucy wasn't telling the story. It was still a character outside of the story. In Ruth and the Green Book that we just read, Ruth is telling the story. She says, my mom and dad, we were going on a trip. I got to be in charge of the Green Book. So that's a first person story completely. Third person is not a character in the story. It is the most common. It is the most common way to tell a story. Think about very popular books like Harry Potter. Obviously, we are with Harry Potter most of the time. We know what he's thinking and feeling, but it doesn't say, I woke up under the stairs at at the Dursleys' house. It says Harry. It doesn't say I. It's still a third person point of view. There are actually three different types of third person point of view, and I want to go over those super quickly. I'm not going to ask you to be able to tell me the difference, but I want you to know there are lots of different kinds of third person point of view. Um, there's, oh, sorry, I hate it when that little bar pops up. The first one is the person outside of the story. So that's the first one we see with the narrator here outside of the story. You have the characters in the story here. The narrator doesn't have access to all their thoughts and all their feelings. He just sees what's going on and reports the story as he sees them. He's the objective narrator. He just is looking out from the outside in and telling the story. In the limited, it's called limited omniscient, actually. Actually, let's skip to the end and just look at omniscient. You still have a narrator who's outside the story, but this narrator knows everything that every character thinks and everything that every character feels and everything they say and everything they do. He knows all. He's omniscient. Omniscient means all knowing. You can be a limited omniscient narrator and only know about the thoughts and feelings of one character, but still be looking at the story from the outside. That's what we had in Holes. We had a limited omniscient narrator. He knew the thoughts and the feelings of Stanley, but he was still seeing the story unfold and telling us the story as he saw it. So we have objective, limited omniscient, and omniscient. Those are our three types. And we're not going to go over that anymore. What I do want to show you is what I'm going to ask you to do today. Today you're going to be completing this form called Point of View, Who's Telling the Story? And if you notice, I've got some information here that you might need. So it says the narrator tells what happens in a story. Sometimes it's a character in the story, or sometimes it is someone else who does not take part in the story. There are two main types of narrators, the first person and the third person. We just went over. In the first person narrations, the narrator is usually a main character and uses I or me to tell the story that's happening to himself or herself. In third person narrations, the narrator is not a main character and they use she, he, they, or it. The words I and me are only used in conversation, not as part of the actual story. So below are some passages from some classic books. I want you to read them, and it says write what type of narration. I just want you to choose first or third person. So let's look at the one together. My father had a small estate in Nottinghamshire. I was the third of 5 sons. He sent me to Emmanuel College in Cambridge at 14 years old, where I resided 3 years and applied myself close to my studies. This is from Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Let's look at those pronouns first of all. We have my, I, he, but me, I, myself. Anytime we use I or me or myself, and the narrator is using those words to tell the story, it's first person. So this first one is going to be first person. Okay, let's look at the next one. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who was usually very late in the mornings, save upon those not infrequent occasions when he was up all night, was seated at the breakfast table. I stood upon the hearth rug and picked up the stick with which our visitor had left behind the night before. This is from The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Again, you have Mr. Sherlock Holmes, but then you have I stood upon the hearth rug and picked the stick which our visitor had left. So even though Mr. Holmes, Sherlock's not telling the story, someone else is telling it from their perspective. They use the word I and they use the word our. So again, this one has to be first person. Okay. Mary asked no more questions, but waited in the darkness of her corner, keeping her eyes on the window. The carriage lamp cast rays of light a little distance ahead of them, and she caught glimpses of the things they passed. That's from The Secret Garden, which is one of my all-time favorite books, too. Do you see any of the pronouns I or me or my or myself in there? Nope. Mary's not telling the story. Someone else is telling the story. So this one is going to be third person. I have now done half of this assignment for you. You've got 3 more passages like that to figure out, and then I've given you 2 sentences, and I want you to tell me in this one which one's in first person, and in this one which one's in third person. And we'll talk about second person in our next activity together.